In a fantastical realm where life and death are governed by a secret council of reapers, one grim reaper, stoic and mysterious, is assigned to retrieve the soul of a prince. However, the prince, playful and rebellious, manages to escape the reaper's grasp through forbidden magic. The prince's mischievous defiance intrigues the reaper, setting them on a collision course of life-threatening battles, heart-stopping betrayals, and undeniable attraction. Along the way, they uncover truths about the balance of life and death that threaten to unravel their world. The moonlit divide, a thin veil between the realms of the living and the dead, shimmered faintly under a violet sky. It was here that reapers gathered, their silhouettes blending into the shadows, cloaked in ancient, flowing robes. Each reaper was bound to their duty, to guide the lost souls across this bridge into eternal peace or eternal punishment. Among them stood Kale, the grim reaper of the Western Gate. His presence was as cold as the northern winds, his silver eyes void of emotion. For centuries, Kale had walked this bridge, unyielding and unbroken. He carried his scythe, a weapon forged from starlight and darkness, a tool that severed the ties of mortal lives. No soul had ever escaped him, until now. A name whispered through the Reaper's realm. Lorien Everell, the Crown Prince of Arendor. His soul, marked by fate, was meant to be harvested at the stroke of midnight. But when Kale arrived at the palace, the prince was waiting, not in fear, but with a smirk that dared to defy death itself. "You're late," Lorien had said, lounging on his gilded throne, his emerald green eyes gleaming with mischief. "I was starting to think the Grim Reaper was just a myth." Kale had stared at him, unblinking, unamused. "You were meant to be dead." But Lorien had other plans. With a flick of his wrist, he activated a spell that sent a surge of golden light spiraling through the room. Forbidden magic, ancient and unpredictable, tore through the fabric of the Reaper's control. Kale had tried to pull the soul from Lorien's body, but something had gone wrong. The prince lived, and now Kale was bound to him, not as his Reaper, but as his reluctant protector. Kale prowled through the golden halls of the palace like a storm cloud, his scythe emitting faint whispers of otherworldly power. He loathed the mortal realm, the warmth, the noise, the suffocating emotions that clung to life like a desperate lover. And now he was shackled to the worst of them. Lorien Everell, the arrogant prince who had defied death itself. Lorien trailed behind him, his emerald eyes glinting with mischief. "Do you always sulk, or is this a special act just for me?" Kale ignored him, his strides purposeful, but Lorien was undeterred. "I mean, if we're going to be stuck together, we might as well get to know each other. What's your favorite color? Do Reapers even have hobbies? Oh, do you eat souls like snacks, or is that just a myth?" Kale stopped so abruptly that Lorien almost collided with him. The Reaper turned slowly, his silver eyes narrowing. "Do you ever stop talking?" "Not if I can help it." Lorien grinned, leaning casually against a marble pillar. "What's wrong? Don't tell me the almighty Grim Reaper can't handle a bit of conversation." Kale's jaw clenched. "You're not supposed to be alive." Lorien rolled his eyes. Yes, I'm aware. You've said that about 20 times today alone. But here's a fun fact. I am alive, and now you're stuck with me. Maybe it's fate." He winked, his playful tone masking the tension in his voice. Kale's scowl deepened. "Fate doesn't make mistakes." "Then maybe it's destiny," Lorien said with a mock-serious expression. "Two souls bound together across realms, defying the natural order. Sounds like the beginning of a tragic love story, doesn't it?" Kale's eyes flashed, but before he could respond, a deafening crash echoed from the lower halls. Both men turned toward the sound, their banter forgotten. "What now?" Lorien muttered, drawing a jeweled dagger from his belt. Kale, silent as ever, had already vanished into the shadows, his presence chilling the air as he moved toward the disturbance. An unexpected threat. In the grand atrium, the source of the noise became clear. 4 intruders, cloaked in black, stood in a circle, chanting in low guttural tones. Their voices reverberated with dark energy, sending ripples through the fabric of reality. Kale materialized in the center of the room, his scythe slicing through the air with a sharp hiss. "Leave," he commanded, his voice low and deadly. "This is my domain." The leader of the group stepped forward, his face hidden beneath a hood. "You have failed, Kale. The prince's survival threatens the balance. The council has sent us to correct your mistake." Lorien appeared at the top of the staircase, his expression a mix of defiance and curiosity. "Correct it? That's an awfully dramatic way of saying, 'Kill me.'" The leader snarled, his hand reaching for a weapon, but before he could draw it, Kale's scythe was at his throat. "You will not touch him," Kale said, his voice cold as ice. The leader laughed, a hollow, echoing sound. "You protect the very thing that will destroy you, Reaper. The bond has already begun." "What bond?" Lorien asked, descending the stairs with calculated ease. "You mean the one where he glares at me constantly? It's not exactly romantic, if that's what you're implying." The intruder ignored him, addressing Kale instead. "You think you're strong enough to defy the council? You're a fool." Kale didn't respond. With a swift motion, he swung his scythe, severing the leader's connection to the physical realm. The remaining intruders lunged, and chaos erupted. The fight! The battle was a blur of light and shadow. Kale moved with inhuman precision, his scythe weaving deadly arcs through the air. Lorien, for his part, proved surprisingly adept, dodging attacks with feline grace and landing calculated strikes with his dagger. "You're not half bad for a prince," Kale remarked coldly as he dispatched another enemy. "Is that a compliment?" Lorien shot back, blocking an attack with a swift parry. "Careful, Kale. People might start to think you like me." Kale didn't dignify that with a response, but the faintest twitch of his lips betrayed a hint of amusement. As the last intruder fell, their form dissolving into ash, Kale turned to Lorien, his expression grim. "They won't stop. The council won't rest until you're dead." Lorien sheathed his dagger, his playful mask slipping just enough to reveal a flicker of vulnerability. "Then I guess we'd better figure out why I'm still alive." Back in Lorien's chambers, the prince leaned against the edge of his desk, studying Kale with uncharacteristic seriousness. "They mentioned something about a bond. What did they mean?" Kale hesitated. For the first time in centuries, uncertainty flickered across his face. "The spell you used, it tethered us. Your survival is tied to my presence. If I leave you, your soul will unravel, and if you die, I take you with me," Lorien finished, a faint smile playing on his lips. Kale nodded, his gaze piercing. "This isn't a game, Lorien. You've disrupted the balance of life and death. There will be consequences." Lorien shrugged, the playful glint returning to his eyes. "Well, if we're going to face the apocalypse, we might as well have fun doing it." Kale sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Why me?" The castle of Arendor, once a place of glittering ballrooms and endless feasts, now felt like a prison. Lorien hated it. After the attack, Kale had insisted on keeping the prince confined to his chambers, the Reaper's piercing silver gaze watching his every move. "You can't keep me locked up forever," Lorien protested, lounging dramatically on his bed as Kale stood guard by the window, his scythe glinting ominously in the fading light. "I can," Kale replied flatly. "And I will. Until I figure out how to sever this bond, your survival depends on staying alive." Lorien sat up, crossing his arms. "Don't you think I'd survive better if I wasn't sitting here like a helpless target? Besides, I have better things to do than stare at your moody face all day." Kale glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "You're insufferable." "And you're boring," Lorien shot back, smirking. "I'd suggest a personality transplant, but I'm guessing the afterlife doesn't offer those." Kale turned back to the window without another word, but Lorien didn't miss the faint flicker of amusement in his eyes. Later that night, Lorien woke to the sound of whispers, soft, haunting voices that seemed to drift through the walls. He sat up, his heart racing, and noticed Kale standing rigid in the corner, his scythe glowing faintly. "You hear them too?" Lorien asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kale nodded, his expression tense. "They're soul echoes, residual fragments from the attack." "What do they want?" "To warn us." Before Lorien could press further, the room's temperature plummeted, frost creeping along the windows. The whispers grew louder, forming words that sent chills down Lorien's spine. "The veil weakens. The bond fractures. Beware the warden." Kale's grip tightened on his scythe, his jaw clenched. "The warden of the veil," he muttered, almost to himself. "Who's that?" Lorien asked, standing now. "The enforcer of balance. If the council believes you're a threat to the realm, they'll send the warden to eliminate you, and anyone connected to you." "So us." Kale's silence was all the confirmation Lorien needed. The next morning, Lorien insisted they leave the castle. "If we're being hunted, sitting here isn't going to help. We need answers, and I know where to start." Kale hesitated, but ultimately agreed. The two set off for the Forgotten Sanctum, an ancient library hidden deep in the enchanted forests of Arendor, It was said to hold records of every prophecy, curse, and bond ever woven into the fabric of existence. The journey was anything but smooth. "Do you have to walk so fast?" Lorien complained, struggling to keep up with Kale's brisk pace. "If you're tired, I'll carry you," Kale said without looking back. Lorien blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Wait, was that sarcasm? Did the Grim Reaper just make a joke?" Kale glanced over his shoulder, his expression as stoic as ever. "No," Lorien groaned. "You're impossible." The sanctum was a sight to behold, a towering structure of obsidian and crystal, hidden beneath the sprawling roots of a colossal tree. Inside, the air shimmered with magic, and endless rows of glowing tomes stretched into the darkness. Lorien and Kale searched for hours before finding a record of their bond. The text was written in an ancient language, but Kale translated it with ease. "The Soulforge Bond," he read aloud. "A tether formed by forbidden magic, tying a mortal's soul to an immortal's essence. If severed prematurely, both will perish. The bond can only be broken by—" Kale's voice trailed off, his expression darkening. "By what?" Lorien pressed. Kale hesitated. "By fulfilling its purpose." "And what's the purpose?" Kale didn't answer, but the look in his eyes sent a shiver through Lorien. Whatever it wasn't good. As they left the sanctum, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. Kale's hand went to his scythe, and Lorien instinctively drew his dagger. "Something's watching us," Kale said softly. Lorien scanned the shadows, his heart pounding. "What is it?" "The Warden," Kale replied, his voice grim. "It's already here." A figure emerged from the darkness, a towering, faceless being cloaked in silver flames. Its presence was suffocating, its power undeniable. "Kale, Grim Reaper of the Western Gate," the Warden intoned, its voice echoing like 1,000 souls crying out at once. "You have defied the Council. Surrender the mortal or face annihilation." Kale stepped protectively in front of Lorien, his scythe at the ready. "You'll have to go through me." For the first time, Lorien saw something other than icy detachment in Kale's eyes. He saw fire, a burning determination to protect him at all costs. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the Warden loomed before them, its silver flames casting eerie shadows on the ancient trees. Kale stood firm, his scythe gleaming with an otherworldly light, while Lorien fought the instinct to step back. "You can't win against that," Lorien whispered, gripping his dagger tighter. "I don't need to win," Kale replied, his voice steady. "I just need to protect you." The Warden raised an ethereal hand, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. "You defy the Council's will, Reaper. This mortal is an aberration, and his existence threatens the balance." "Balance?" Lorien said, stepping forward despite Kale's sharp glare. "You're talking about balance when you're here to murder someone who's just trying to survive?" "Silence," the Warden commanded, and its voice reverberated through Lorien's chest, stealing his breath. Kale lunged, his scythe carving through the air in a deadly arc. The Warden countered effortlessly, its fiery form shifting and reforming with unnatural grace. The battle was like nothing Lorien had ever seen. Kale moved with inhuman precision, his scythe clashing against the Warden's fiery attacks. Each strike sent shockwaves through the forest, shattering trees and scorching the ground. But the Warden was relentless, and Kale was beginning to falter. "Lorien, run!" Kale shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. "No way!" Lorien called back, his heart pounding. "I'm not leaving you to fight that thing alone." Kale gritted his teeth, barely dodging a blazing strike. This isn't a debate. But Lorien wasn't listening. Instead, he noticed something. The Warden hesitated every time it got too close to him. An idea began to form, reckless and probably suicidal, but it was better than standing by and watching Kale get overwhelmed. Before he could second-guess himself, Lorien stepped forward, placing himself directly in the Warden's path. "What are you doing?" Kale roared, his silver eyes wide with fury. "Testing a theory." Lorien shouted back. The Warden froze, its flames dimming slightly as it turned its faceless gaze toward Lorien. "You cannot interfere with him, can you?" Lorien said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. "The bond prevents you from harming me." The Warden remained silent, but its hesitation was answer enough. Kale took advantage of the distraction, launching a devastating strike that severed one of the Warden's fiery limbs. The creature recoiled, its form flickering. "We're leaving," Kale said, grabbing Lorien's arm and pulling him away from the battlefield. "But! Now!" They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the forest, where the trees thinned and the stars stretched endlessly overhead. Kale finally let go of Lorien's arm, his expression stormy. "Do you have a death wish?" Kale demanded, his voice like thunder. "I saved your life," Lorien shot back, his chest heaving. "You put yourself in danger." "Well, excuse me for not wanting to watch you get turned into Reaper dust." Lorien's voice cracked, and he looked away, his fists clenched. "I'm tired of being the one who always needs saving." Kale's anger faltered, replaced by something softer. "You don't need to prove anything to me, Lorien." "Maybe not," Lorien said, his voice quieter now. "But I'm not just some helpless mortal. I've fought to survive my entire life. I'm not going to stop now." Kale stepped closer, his silver eyes searching Lorien's face. "You're more stubborn than any soul I've ever encountered." Lorien managed a small smile. "I'll take that as a compliment." For a moment, the tension between them shifted, the air growing heavy with something unspoken. But before either could say anything, a sharp pain lanced through Lorien's chest, and he collapsed to the ground. Kale was at his side instantly, his expression panicked for the first time. "What's happening?" "I don't know," Lorien gasped, clutching at his chest as the pain intensified. A ghostly light began to emanate from his body, forming the outline of a symbol over his heart. Kale's eyes widened in recognition. "The Soul-Forged seal," he whispered. "What does it mean?" Lorien choked out. Kale hesitated, his hands trembling. "It means the bond is activating. Your soul is merging with mine." Lorien's breath hitched, his emerald eyes locking onto Kale's. "What happens if it completes?" Kale didn't answer, but the fear in his expression spoke volumes. Once the pain subsided, Kale helped Lorien to his feet. They were both shaken, but there was no time to rest. "We need to find the Oracle," Kale said, his voice grim. "Who's that?" Lorien asked, leaning heavily on him. "She's the only one who can decipher the full prophecy," Kale explained. "If we don't figure out the purpose of this bond, the Council will destroy us both." "And if the bond completes before we do?" Lorien asked. Kale's expression darkened. "Then we'll both cease to exist." The journey to the Oracle was fraught with peril. The forests grew darker and the air became colder as Kale and Lorien traversed the shadowed paths. Yet, amidst the dangers, their growing bond became impossible to ignore. A moment by the fire. One night, after hours of walking, they stopped to rest near a quiet stream. Kale silently built a fire, his movements precise and efficient. Lorien, exhausted, leaned against a fallen log, watching him. "Do you ever get tired?" Lorien asked, his voice breaking the silence. Kale glanced at him, his silver eyes catching the firelight. "Reapers don't feel fatigue." "Of course you don't," Lorien muttered, brushing a hand through his messy hair. "Must be nice to be so perfect." Kale froze for a fraction of a second before resuming his work. "Perfect is not a word I'd use to describe myself." Lorien chuckled softly. "No? Then what would you call yourself?" Kale didn't answer, but as the fire crackled to life, Lorien caught the faintest flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. They sat in silence for a while, the warmth of the fire easing the tension of the day. Lorien couldn't help stealing glances at Kale, his heart skipping each time their eyes met. There was something magnetic about the Reaper, an unyielding strength tempered by moments of unexpected gentleness. When Kale finally looked back, their gazes locked. Neither spoke, but the air between them seemed to hum with unspoken words. Lorien's cheeks flushed and he quickly turned away, pretending to stoke the fire. Kale watched him for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. The next day, the path grew treacherous, with jagged rocks and unstable ground. At one particularly steep incline, Lorien slipped, a startled cry escaping his lips. Before he could hit the ground, Kale was there, his strong arms catching him effortlessly. "Careful," Kale said, his voice low and steady. Lorien's heart raced as he looked up into Kale's face, their proximity leaving him breathless. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. He was hyper-aware of Kale's hands on him, the way the Reaper's silver eyes softened ever so slightly as they met his. I'm fine," Lorien stammered, pulling away quickly. His cheeks burned, but he couldn't stop the small smile tugging at his lips. Kale didn't say anything, but as they continued, Lorien noticed him staying closer than usual, his hand occasionally brushing Lorien's arm to steady him. By the time they reached the Oracle's lair, the tension between them was palpable. The Oracle, a wizened figure draped in shimmering robes, greeted them with a knowing smile. I see the bond is working its magic, she said, her voice echoing with an otherworldly quality. Kale stiffened. We're not here for cryptic comments. Tell us how to break it. The oracle laughed softly. Oh, Kale, always so direct, but the answer isn't as simple as you'd like. She turned to Lorien, her gaze piercing. The bond was forged for a reason. To break it, you must first understand what it truly means. What does it mean? Lorien asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The oracle smiled enigmatically. It means your fates are entwined. To sever it would destroy you both, but to embrace it could save not only your lives, but the balance of the realms. Kale's jaw tightened. That's not an answer. Sometimes the only way forward is through the heart, the oracle said, her gaze lingering on Kale. You'll understand soon enough. A heartbeat away. As they left the oracle's lair, Lorien couldn't shake her words. He stole a glance at Kale, who walked ahead, his posture rigid and his scythe resting on his shoulder. You're quiet, Lorien said, catching up to him. Kale didn't look at him. Her words mean nothing. We'll find another way. Do you really believe that? Lorien asked, stepping in front of Kale to block his path. Because I don't think you're as indifferent as you pretend to be. Kale's silver eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of something deeper beneath the surface, something raw and vulnerable. What do you want from me, Lorien? Kale asked, his voice quiet but intense. Lorien hesitated, his heart pounding. I want to know why you care. Why you keep risking everything for me. Kale took a step closer, and Lorien felt his breath hitch. The space between them disappeared, and for a moment it felt as though the entire world had fallen away. I don't know, Kale admitted, his voice barely audible. But I can't stop. Lorien's heart raced as they stood there, so close yet so unsure. The unspoken tension between them crackled like a storm, but neither made a move to break it. The air grew heavier as Kale and Lorien ventured further from the oracle's lair. The path ahead was treacherous, but the true challenge lay in the emotions simmering between them, feelings neither dared to name but could no longer ignore. A stormy Sheltk approached, the sky darkened, and thunder rumbled in the distance. We need to find shelter, Kale said, scanning the horizon. Lorien, already weary from the day's journey, nodded. You don't say. It's not like I'm built for running through lightning storms. Kale shot him a look, but the corner of his mouth twitched, almost as if he wanted to smile. Lorien caught the flicker and couldn't help teasing. Was that almost a smile? Careful, your stoic Reaper image might crack. Focus, Kale replied, though his tone lacked its usual sharpness. They found refuge in the ruins of an old watchtower. As the storm raged outside, they sat in silence, the only light coming from the faint glow of Kale's scythe. Lorien leaned against the wall, watching the rain streak down the broken windows. You know, for someone who claims to feel nothing, you're surprisingly good at taking care of me. Kale glanced at him. It's my duty. Right, duty, Lorien said with a wry smile. Because risking your life for me multiple times is just part of the job description. Kale didn't respond, but his grip on the scythe tightened. Lorien noticed and leaned forward, his emerald eyes gleaming in the dim light. You can admit it, you know, Lorien said softly, that you care. Kale's gaze snapped to him, sharp and intense. You think this is easy for me? Every moment with you, I'm walking a line I shouldn't cross. Why not cross it? Lorien whispered, his heart pounding. Kale stood abruptly, turning away. Because if I do, I won't be able to protect you. Later that night, as Lorien dozed off against the wall, Kale sat nearby, keeping watch. He allowed himself a rare moment to study the mortal, his messy hair, his face softened in sleep, the faint rise and fall of his chest. Kale's chest tightened with an unfamiliar ache. He didn't know what it was, only that it both terrified and drew him closer. Without thinking, he reached out, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from Lorien's face. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt through him, and he pulled back as if burned. Kale, Lorien murmured in his sleep, his voice soft and unguarded. Kale's breath caught. He turned away, silently cursing himself. An ambush in the dark. They were attacked just before dawn. Shades, soulless creatures of shadow, emerged from the storm, their twisted forms lunging at the pair. Kale fought with deadly precision, his scythe cutting through the shades like a blade through smoke. Lorien, armed with his dagger, held his own, but was quickly overwhelmed. Lorien, Kale shouted, his voice raw with panic. A shade lashed out, its claws grazing Lorien's side. He cried out, falling to his knees. Kale was there in an instant, his scythe glowing brighter as he obliterated the remaining shades in a single, furious strike. "Are you hurt?" Kale asked, dropping to his knees beside Lorien. "Just a scratch," Lorien said through gritted teeth. Kale inspected the wound, his touch surprisingly gentle. Their eyes met, and for a moment the chaos around them faded. "You scared me," Kale admitted, his voice barely audible. Lorien's breath hitched. "I thought Reapers didn't get scared." Kale didn't respond. Instead, he reached up and cupped Lorien's face, his thumb brushing against his cheek. "You're different," Kale said, his silver eyes softening. "You make me feel alive." Lorien's heart raced. He leaned into Kale's touch, their faces inches apart. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting. But before they could close the distance, the ground beneath them rumbled, and a fissure split the earth.
The edge of despair.
They barely escaped the collapsing terrain, finding themselves on a precarious cliff overlooking a churning sea. The storm raged on, lightning illuminating the jagged rocks below. Kale pulled Lorien close, shielding him from the wind. "We need to move quickly." Lorien looked up at him, his eyes wide. "Kale, what happens if we don't make it?" Kale hesitated, his resolve faltering. "We will. But if we don't," Lorien pressed. Kale's arms tightened around him. "Then I'll make sure you're safe, even if it means giving everything I have." Lorien's chest ached at the raw emotion in Kale's voice. He reached up, placing a hand on Kale's cheek. "You're not losing me that easily." Kale looked at him, his expression conflicted. "You make this so much harder than it needs to be." "Good," Lorien said with a small smile, "because I'm not letting you push me away." The cliffs gave way to a hidden path leading toward the sea. The storm still raged, but Kale and Lorien pressed on, their bond stronger than ever, yet heavy with unspoken emotions. They had reached the final stretch of their journey, an ancient temple where the bond's origin and purpose would be revealed. As they reached the shoreline, the storm quieted, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. The temple rose from the sand like a forgotten relic, its spires jagged and dark against the sky. "Doesn't exactly scream welcome, does it?" Lorien said, trying to lighten the tension. Kale didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the temple, his grip on his scythe tightening. "Hey," Lorien said, touching his arm. "Whatever's in there, we'll face it together." Kale glanced down at him, and for a moment his hardened expression softened. "You're too brave for your own good." "Guess you'll just have to keep saving me," Lorien said with a wink. Despite himself, Kale let out a low chuckle. The temple's truth. Inside, the air was thick with ancient magic. Symbols carved into the walls glowed faintly, illuminating the path. At the heart of the temple stood a massive altar, where a shimmering orb of light hovered. "The bond's origin lies there," Kale said, his voice tense. As they approached, the orb pulsed, and a voice echoed through the chamber. "Kale, the Reaper, and Lorien, the Mortal, your fates are entwined by design, forged to restore balance to the realms." "Restore balance?" Lorien asked, his brow furrowing. The voice continued. "The mortal realm teeters on the edge of chaos. Kale, your heart was bound to Lorien's to awaken what lies dormant within you. The power of choice, of love, of humanity. Together you must protect the realms from the rising darkness." Kale stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "And if we break the bond?" The voice grew somber. "To sever the bond is to sever your connection to life itself. Both of you would perish." Lorien's heart sank. He looked at Kale, whose expression was unreadable. "There has to be another way." "There is not," the voice said. "But the bond is not a curse. It is a gift, should you choose to embrace it." The darkness awakens. Before they could respond, the temple began to tremble. Shadows gathered, coalescing into a monstrous form, a Shade King, a being of pure darkness. "You cannot defeat me," the Shade King roared. "Surrender the bond, and I may spare your lives." Kale stepped in front of Lorien, his scythe glowing with celestial light. "Over my dead body." "Kale, wait," Lorien shouted. But Kale had already charged, his movements swift and precise. The battle was brutal, the Shade King's attacks relentless. Lorien, desperate to help, searched the altar for anything he could use. "Lorien!" Kale's voice rang out as the Shade King's shadowy tendrils lashed toward him. Without thinking, Lorien dove in front of Kale, shielding him with his own body. The impact sent him flying, pain ripping through him as he hit the ground. "Lorien!" Kale cried, his voice filled with panic. The sight of Lorien lying motionless ignited something within Kale. His scythe blazed brighter than ever, and with a primal roar, he unleashed a devastating strike that obliterated the Shade King in a blinding flash of light. The confession. As the dust settled, Kale rushed to Lorien's side. "Stay with me," he pleaded, his voice shaking. "Don't you dare leave me." Lorien's eyes fluttered open, a weak smile on his lips. "You're worried about me?" Kale let out a shaky laugh, tears glistening in his silver eyes. "You idiot. Of course I'm worried." "Didn't think reapers could cry," Lorien teased, his voice barely above a whisper. Kale cupped Lorien's face, his thumb brushing away a tear. "You're the exception to all my rules." Lorien's heart swelled at the raw emotion in Kale's eyes. Despite the pain, he reached up and touched Kale's cheek. "I guess I'm stuck with you, then." Kale leaned closer, their foreheads touching. "You make me wish I could stop time, just to stay in this moment." Lorien's breath hitched. "Then don't stop. Just stay." Kale hesitated for only a moment before closing the distance, their lips meeting in a kiss that was both tender and desperate, filled with all the emotions they could no longer deny. The bond's power. The temple glowed as the bond between them solidified, its light enveloping them both. Lorien's injuries healed, and Kale felt a warmth he hadn't known in centuries. The voice returned, softer this time. "The bond has awakened its true power. Together, you are unstoppable. Protect the realms, and protect each other." Kale helped Lorien to his feet, his arm around his waist. "So," Lorien said, leaning into him, "does this mean I'm stuck with you forever?" Kale smirked, his silver eyes twinkling. "You'll manage." They left the temple, the storm finally clearing. For the first time, Kale felt hope, not just for the realms, but for himself. And as Lorien slipped his hand into Kale's, the Reaper knew he'd found something worth fighting for. The sun rose over the horizon, casting its golden light over the tranquil sea. Kale and Lorien stood at the cliff's edge, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. The storm had passed, both in the skies and in their hearts. Lorien stretched, his playful grin back in full force. "Well, that was fun. Save the world, fight a shadow monster, and oh yeah, fall for a reaper. Just another Tuesday." Kale raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth twitching in amusement. "You're impossible, and you're stuck with me." Kale turned to face him fully, his silver eyes softening. "That's not a punishment." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Kale reached out, tucking a strand of Lorien's hair behind his ear. His touch lingered, a silent promise in the gesture. "You know," Lorien said, his voice quieter, "for someone who claimed to feel nothing, you've become awfully human." Kale's lips curved into a rare, genuine smile. "You've made it impossible not to." Lorien's heart skipped a beat. He took a step closer, their faces inches apart. "You're not bad at this whole emotional vulnerability thing, you know?" Kale chuckled softly. "Don't get used to it." A future to protect. Their journey back to the mortal realm was quieter, but not without its challenges. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day, a constant reminder of the destiny they shared. One evening, as they set up camp beneath the stars, Lorien broke the silence. "So what happens now?" he asked, poking at the fire with a stick. Kale looked up from sharpening his scythe. "We protect the realms. Together." "Together," Lorien repeated, a small smile playing on his lips. Kale hesitated, then added, "And maybe we figure out what this is between us." Lorien's smile widened. "Finally admitting you're crazy about me, huh?" Kale shook his head, but there was a softness in his expression. "I think you already knew. A new threat looms." As they crossed the boundary back into the mortal realm, the air felt different, charged with an unfamiliar energy. Lorien stopped, his brow furrowing. "Do you feel that?" Kale nodded, his grip tightening on his scythe. "The darkness isn't gone. It's only just begun." Lorien sighed, but his grin quickly returned. "Well, guess it's a good thing you've got me around." Kale glanced at him, his eyes filled with both exasperation and affection. "And I suppose I'll have to keep saving you." "Always," Lorien said, winking. As they walked into the unknown, side by side, the bond between them burned brighter than ever, a light strong enough to withstand whatever darkness lay ahead. From the shadows, a figure watched them go, its presence cloaked in mystery. "They think they've won," the figure murmured, its voice like a hiss. "But the real game has just begun." Its laughter echoed through the void, a chilling promise of trials yet to come. And so their story continued. A tale of love, danger, and destiny, written across realms and sealed by a bond that would defy even death itself.
If you like this story, please like, share, subscribe.